Hey, this is Alex Yoder with Pro Tip Tuesday, my favorite day of the week. We are here to give free advice to landlords and property managers on sort of best practice and sort of tips and tricks that we deal with on a daily basis. I've been wanting to talk about mold for a while now, and I'm very fortunate to have you today, Frank. Thank you so much for coming out. This is Frank with Integrity Air Quality, and I'm going to go into several questions, and I want to hear your perspective.
Okay.
What I'd like to do is just kind of jump right into it. What I'd like to do first is talk about mold. And, you know, if you watch TV at all, even when you're watching these real estate shows and you hear agents talking about black mold, toxic mold, I feel like they throw that term around really loosely, and I think it creates some false perceptions about mold.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to hear what kind of your thoughts on black mold or toxic mold.
Yeah. Well, Alex, first of all, scientifically, there's no such thing as a type of mold called black mold. And there's no such thing scientifically as a type of mold called toxic mold. Those are the two main things that people tend to use, those two terms. I believe that those terms were coined by people in the restoration industry to scare people, right? They're scary terms. But scientifically, there's no such things as those types of mold. Black, as I like to tell people, black is a color. It's not a type of mold.
Yeah. So what I've heard before is that many or most types of mold can become black.
Absolutely. Yeah. When mold is growing, right? Again, mold can turn black or white. It can be all sorts of colors. But people will a lot of times just see black in the color or some grout in the tile or something, and oh my gosh, I've got black mold. And there's just no such thing as a type of mold called black mold.
Okay. And in terms of toxic mold, I understand that some types of mold can be toxic to some specific individuals because it is an allergen, correct?
Yes. So what I like to tell people is that when we say there's no such thing as black mold and taking that off the table, that doesn't mean we're all out of the woods, so to speak, and that there's no dangers to mold. The two primary things that you have to be concerned about when it comes to mold, the first is allergies. If somebody's got an allergy to a very specific type of mold, then for them it can be bad, right? But that doesn't make it bad for everybody. The second thing is, so if you take that allergy piece and put it over here, the next thing that you got to be careful for when it comes to mold is simply high concentrations of abnormal levels of anything are bad for people. So if you've got, if you've got somebody that works in a restaurant where they're smoking and they work there for years, you got an old guy that works on a coal mine in West Virginia for years, if you're breathing in that coal dust or cigarette smoke or anything over long periods of time, that is not going to be good for your body, right? The X factor is the human body, though. Everybody's body responds differently to everything. So why does one guy smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and he dies at 50, and another guy smokes 4 packs of cigarettes a day and he lives to be 110, right? The X factor is the human body. So primarily you just got to be thinking allergies or high concentrations of just too much bad stuff in the air is not good for anybody.
Okay. So you're talking like spore count versus, the type of mold is really something else that we can go into.
Yeah, so generally because people think black mold is the bad type of mold, oftentimes they're trying to figure out, is the type of mold they've got in their house black mold, the bad type? When the National Center for Disease Control actually says there's no one type of mold that's any more dangerous than another. That's right on the National Center for Disease Control's website. There's no single type of mold any more dangerous than another. So if you look at that, then finding out what type of mold it is actually is only relevant to somebody who's got a very specific allergy to that. And when I say an allergy, I'm talking about somebody that's been diagnosed by a doctor as having a very specific allergy, because we come across people all the time that say, oh, I'm allergic to mold. And we'll ask the question, have you been diagnosed? Well, no, but I'm allergic to mold. Right. And so we just want to clarify, right, what that means.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, so that kind of goes into what I wanted to ask you next, which is I'd like to hear about sort of the testing methods, you as a testing expert. And I know I do want to talk about briefly that, in the testing world, in the mold world, sort of the type versus spore count issue has always been and still is somewhat of a point of debate. between testing companies.
Sure.
But I've always been the work that you've done for us and kind of the method that you do it in. I'm a huge fan of, and so I'd like to hear about sort of what that looks like. Talk a little bit about the sort of the Petri dish versus the method that you use.
So there's, if you think for just a second, Alex, about the difference between a film camera and a digital camera, right? With the film camera, you've got to buy the film, take the picture, send it away for processing, wait for the results to come back. With a digital camera, you take a picture and there it is. In the testing world, that's essentially the major difference. The old cassette method of testing or Petri dish method of testing was buy the dish or the cassette, take an aerial or surface sample, send it off, wait for the results, et cetera, right?
And while you're waiting, the house is getting worse, right?
And potentially while you're waiting, it's getting worse.
Right.
Or let's just say that potentially the house is bad when we talk about abnormal levels in there. Let's say there's abnormal levels in there and you're in that environment. Now you're waiting for the results for days or a week to come back and you're now still in that environment, right? So in the cassette world, some of the things that oftentimes you'll not hear people talk about are, first of all, when they take a cassette sample, it's very common that they'll only sample a couple of rooms in the house, usually one, maybe two.
And is that because they're trying to cut down on cost, or is it just kind of?
I believe they're trying to cut down on cost. That's my opinion, right?
Because they do charge. I'm guessing they charge. It's been a while since I did one of those, but I think they charge per room or per.
That's right. They charge per room or per sample, right? And so here's the thing: once something's airborne, then it can move around in the air with natural pressurization, heating and air conditioning, open doors and windows, those types of things. So if air's always moving and mold does not level off, meaning that what we find here we're going to find in the next room and that room and that room, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't level off, right? So if you're only going to sample one or two rooms, who gets to pick what rooms? And how do you know that you've picked right?
You're just gambling, right?
You're just gambling. That's exactly right. So we tell people, if you're not going to sample every room, don't sample any room, because you're just gambling, right? And if you guess wrong, you won't even know that you guessed wrong, because you won't have the results from the rest of the house to know that, to compare to.
Right.
So another thing to understand about the cassette method of testing is they put this cassette device in the middle of a room. You pull an air sample through the cassette, and generally it sits in the center of, say, the living room. You pull an air sample through there, you send the cassette to the lab. As soon as you use the word lab, people are thinking really official, scientists and microscopes and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
What many people won't tell you is that the lab only looks at about 10% of the slide. Okay, so we're taking one sample from the middle of this room, we're looking at one very small sample of the slide, and this is how their methodology works. If we find one spore of mold X on 1/10 of the slide, then we're going to calculate that there's probably 10 spores on the whole slide. And if we calculate there's 10 spores on the whole slide, we're going to calculate there's probably 1,500 in the whole room. And so it's just a massive extrapolation based off a very poor statistical sampling.
Wow.
With the digital technology, we move the instrument back and forth and across the room and through the room, so you're taking a much broader statistical sampling of the room. And the instrument now analyzes 98% of the air flowing through it, so you're getting a much broader sampling.
And you're getting it immediately.
It's a digital picture, so you know exactly what's happening right now. Now, here's the other key thing. When we're moving the digital technology, what we found is mold moves in little clouds or little pockets. And so when we're sampling a room and we're moving across, we might get a little, on the screen, the computer screen, we see a little blip when we hit a pocket of mold. So we get a little blip here, and then maybe we're moving and we get a little blip there, and then we're moving through the room and a little blip there. And then in the meantime, there's nothing, right? Just these three little blips. When we get done with the digital test, the computer runs an algorithm and it says, hey, I saw that little blip and that blip and that blip, but then I saw all of the nothingness in this room. Right? So what's the real air quality look like given those factors? And it gives you a reading, a green, yellow, or a red reading. With the cassette method, if they put their cassette in the middle of a pocket per se, then he's going to say that's the air quality everywhere. Right. Because it's an extrapolation.
So that could be an exaggeration, or it could be missing stuff entirely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So it's a random room. They're going to try to use some intelligence, try to find, where they're seeing mold and probably test those rooms. But it's generally a gamble in that regard. And then you're testing a very small sample, and then they're looking at a very small portion of that sample.
That's exactly right.
But as opposed to what you do, which is active testing everywhere. and you're getting immediate readings on the
That's
spore
exactly
count.
right.
Yeah, and you're comparing that against exterior.
Yeah, both ways will take an exterior sample. That's exactly right.
Because there's mold everywhere.
Yes.
As we sit in this car, there's mold right now.
Yeah.
So it's really about what's the difference, right, between here and in the home of concern.
That's exactly right. So you're right, there's mold everywhere. So inside, outside your home, my room. So when we're sampling, the question is never, are we going to find mold? The question is what we are finding the normal everyday types and quantities we expect to find in the average indoor environment, or is there something abnormal going on here, right?
Gotcha.
And that's where now here's the other thing. The old cassette method would tell you spore counts. 2 spores of this, 3 spores of that, 27 spores of something else. But all of that raw data was simply there for somebody to look at that and draw a conclusion. Did all of those spore data information tell me this room is fine? Does that data tell me the room's got a little problem? Or does all that data tell me the room's got a bad problem? The new technology simply jumps to that conclusion and gives you a green, yellow, or a red reading per room.
Right.
The old data was irrelevant, only used to draw the conclusion.
Right.
Yes.
And what we're talking about, just really briefly here before we finish up, with the new Colorado warranty of habitability law that we have to deal with, there are specific days that we have to take remedial action. We don't have to resolve the problem within X number of days based on the issue, but we do have to commence remedial action. And even though again, we don't have to have that mold situation resolved within a week or within 2 days or 3 days. I think that it really puts more of a timeline on that, and so it just becomes that much more important to get those tests quickly.
Yes.
So we can just avoid that argument to begin with our tenants. So I thought I'd just point that out as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and to that point, right, if there's mold present, it can only get into your body one of 3 ways. Either you're touching it, you're eating it, or you're breathing it. And since most people don't go around touching or licking those black spots on the wall, your primary exposure point is what would or could be airborne. Yeah. And that's why air testing is so much more important than what we call surface testing. I don't need to do a surface test to tell me if that's mold. I need to find out if there's mold in the air, because that's how it's getting to my body.
Gotcha. Exactly, because it could just be there and be dormant versus releasing spores into the air, and now you have to handle it differently, right? Or the remediation company has to handle it differently.
They have to handle it differently. So, but if somebody's concerned, when you talk about habitability, right? Think about this for a second. When you talk about habitability, what we're saying is it safe for me to be here? And if the only thing that makes it not safe is what's in the air, then that's the primary thing to be testing.
Roger. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say I'm a huge fan of Frank Rudy.
Thank you.
His company is fantastic. We've used him for many years. And I'm really grateful for you to come out today. And I would shake your hand, but I'm holding this stick here. Let's do a fist bump.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah. So again, this is Alex Yoder with Pro Tip Tuesday. You guys have a great week, and we will see you next time. Bye.